Okay, we're here for lesson 9. Are you surrounded by assholes? What I want to talk about today is looking for reality. So, anxiety is confusing because it is a mishmash of things that are worth being anxious about, things that are actual threats in your environment, and things that are not worth being anxious about or not actual threats in your environment. And so as we're looking at chronic anxiety, we're consistently looking for where the reality lies. And the reality is that you might be surrounded by assholes, or you might be surrounded by contextual factors that contribute to your anxiety in a way that we might consider reasonable, that might make sense. So the first thing I want to talk about is looking at your early childhood attachment. And I promise we're not going to blame your anxiety on your childhood, or we're not going to make a big deal out of all of these things, but it is important to look at the ways in which you learned to connect very early in life. So when you were an infant and a very small child, you learned a lot about the way the world works depending on how responsive your caregiver was to you. So if you cried and somebody came to you and picked you up and soothed you, you learned that the world is a safe place. If you were hungry and someone fed you, you learned that resources were going to be available to you. If you cried and nobody came, or if you were hungry and nobody fed you, you learned, you were wired early on that the world is not a safe place and that people are not necessarily going to take care of you. Now, this may seem like a big stretch to say, oh, well, if my caregiver was not very responsive in early childhood, then that's why I'm an adult now and have chronic anxiety. But it's absolutely true. The ways that anxiety gets wired into your brain start very early on. So when you're thinking about your anxiety, think about how you learned to attach early on and what your home life was like in early childhood. You didn't have any control over that. It's not your fault what happened to you in early childhood, but it does give you information about what's happening now. So then the second step to that would be to look at what your context was like in adolescence, when you were going through puberty, when you were in high school, when you were going through periods of your life when there were drastic changes, your body was changing a whole lot, your ideas and your experiences and your beliefs and your values, all of that changed a whole lot. And the things that happened to you during that time period can also cement in some anxiety that might be considered reasonable. So for example, if you were bullied in high school, if you didn't have a strong social group, if you didn't have adults that you could trust, if you didn't have somebody that was your cheerleader, that was encouraging you, that was saying you can do it, that can literally instill a sense of anxiety and the processes of anxiety, which we're going to talk more about in future lessons, how that physiologically happens. But that's a lot of the place where that came from. And of course, looking at relational experiences in adulthood. How have your interactions with people and with systems and with, the general world at large in adulthood, has the world been a safe place for you? Have you been able to get your needs met in a reasonable way? These things all contribute to anxiety, and it makes sense that they would contribute to anxiety. A work environment, if it's high stress, if there are a lot of unreasonable expectations, or if you don't feel safe or secure in your sense of self or your personhood at work, it can trigger a lot of that anxiety and a lot of those anxious responses. And then at home, if your home environment is chaotic, if you don't feel comfortable at home, if you don't feel safe at home, those things can contribute to anxiety as well. I think it's important too to look at your cultural experience. If you are somebody who has a marginalized identity or in any way experience systemic oppression in the world that you live in, again, you're going to have what we might call realistic and reasonable anxiety. And also you may be more likely to embed non-realistic anxiety because you do experience marginalization, and that does activate the nervous system in a different way. So if you are a person of color, if you are somebody with a disability, if you are transgender, if you exist in a marginalized identity every day in the world around you, your nervous system works differently. It's called minority stress. Minority fatigue is another word for it. And so if that applies to you, you might look into that a little bit more and learn more about how anxiety can manifest in the nervous system because of that. So when we look at all these contextual factors and we say, am I surrounded by assholes? Am I in a context that is contributing to my anxiety? Then we move into what can you change and what can you not change. So the things that you can change, and I know when you have chronic anxiety, it feels really difficult to get momentum or to make change in your world. But the things that you can change, if you can start changing them slowly and simply and step by step, you'll start to see a positive result in your anxious systems. The things that you can't control, then we start looking at how you're thinking about and what your beliefs are about those things and how that might be contributing to your anxiety. So we're just finding different ways to respond to these situations. What chronic anxiety does is it's almost like you have all these different ideas and they're printed out in ink, and then anxiety just smushes all of that ink and you can't see what's what. And so it makes it really hard to piece out what is a reasonable anxiety, what can we understand, this is where anxiety is coming from, and what is not, like this doesn't make any sense, we don't understand where this is coming from, and we can treat those two things differently.